Welcome to Life Stories, where we share heartfelt and inspiring tales that will move you deeply. Today's story is about love, betrayal, and resilience. Emily, a bride left at the altar by the love of her life, Jackson, is forced to rebuild her world from scratch. Years later, a shocking encounter changes everything, as she finds herself facing an unexpected battle for her children. Will strength and a mother's love prevail? Join us as we dive into this emotional journey filled with lessons about forgiveness, courage, and the power of family. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for today's story. The warm morning sun spilled through the windows of the elegant hotel suite as Emily Hayes adjusted her wedding dress for what felt like the 100th time. The delicate lace sleeves hugged her arms perfectly, and the shimmering fabric fell gracefully around her. She caught a glimpse of herself in the full-length mirror, her cheeks rosy with excitement, her chestnut hair perfectly styled under her veil. Today was the day she had dreamed of. The day she would become Mrs. Emily Reed. The idea of it made her heart race with anticipation. She would be marrying Jackson Reed, one of the most prominent and successful men in New York City. Everything had been meticulously planned, from the grand ceremony at the cathedral to the reception at a lavish ballroom overlooking the Hudson River. Every detail had been designed to showcase the wealth and love they shared. It wasn't just any wedding, it was an event. Guests from across the country, business magnates, celebrities, and influential figures had all gathered for what was to be the grand union of two lives. Emily had always imagined her wedding day would feel like this, magical, perfect, like the beginning of a fairy tale. But something didn't feel quite right. As she stood in front of the mirror, she noticed her hands were trembling. It was normal, she thought, brushing it off as nerves. She adjusted her veil one last time and smiled at her reflection, trying to shake the unease creeping into her chest. Everything would be fine. Jackson loved her. He had always been a man of big ambitions. But he had promised her that this day, their day, would be perfect. This is the start of forever, he had said just last night during their final call before the wedding. And yet, her heart couldn't shake a small doubt that lingered beneath her excitement. The ringing phone jolted her from her thoughts. Emily glanced at the clock, 11:30 a.m. The ceremony was set to begin in 30 minutes. A wave of unease swept over her as she picked up the phone, her hands still shaking. "Hello," she said, her voice light but trembling slightly. There was a pause on the other end, a silence so heavy it sent shivers down her spine. Then, Jackson's voice came through. It wasn't warm or full of love like she had imagined. It was cold, distant. "Emily," he began. His tone clipped. "I'm not coming." Her heart stopped. "What?" The word left her lips in a whisper, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. "Jackson, what do you mean?" "It's over," he said flatly, the words hitting her like a freight train. "I can't go through with this. There's too much going on with the company right now. I need to focus on that. You'll understand someday." "Understand?" The word echoed in her mind as the line went dead. She stared at the phone in her hand, her vision blurring as tears welled up in her eyes. The world seemed to tilt around her as the truth set in. He wasn't coming. The man she had loved, the man who had promised her a life together, had just abandoned her with no warning, no explanation. The room that had been so full of hope and anticipation now felt empty. The delicate lace of her wedding dress suddenly felt suffocating. She ripped the veil from her head and flung it onto the floor, her chest heaving with the weight of her shattered dreams. Tears streamed down her face as she sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands clutching the fabric of her dress. The minutes ticked by, but Emily couldn't move. She could hear the murmur of voices outside the room, the bustling of hotel staff preparing for a ceremony that would never happen. She thought about the guests, her friends, her family sitting in the cathedral waiting for her to walk down the aisle. The thought of facing them, of explaining what had happened, was unbearable. By the time she finally found the strength to leave the room, the hotel was buzzing with whispers. The staff avoided her gaze, and she could feel the weight of their pity as she walked past them. Cameras flashed as she stepped outside. Paparazzi eager to capture the humiliation of the abandoned bride. Emily pulled her coat tightly around her, shielding herself from their prying eyes as she slipped into a waiting car. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she needed to get away. In the days that followed, the news spread like wildfire. Every tabloid in New York had the story of Jackson Reed leaving his bride at the altar. Headlines painted Emily as a victim, a woman scorned by the city's most eligible bachelor. Paparazzi camped outside her apartment, desperate for a glimpse of her heartbreak. But Emily refused to crumble in public. She avoided their cameras, retreating into the shadows as she tried to figure out how to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She had lost everything. Her job, her friends, even her sense of identity. It had all been tied to Jackson. Without him, she felt adrift, unsure of who she was or where she belonged. She packed up what little she had and left the penthouse they had shared, moving into a tiny apartment in a quiet neighborhood far from the glittering skyscrapers of Manhattan. It wasn't much, but it was hers. For the first time in years, Emily felt free from Jackson's shadow. But just as she began to rebuild her life, a new challenge emerged. One morning, Emily sat in her tiny bathroom staring at a plastic stick in her hands. Her breath hitched as she watched the second line appear. Faint but undeniable. Pregnant. The word echoed in her mind, filling her with a mix of fear, confusion, and a tiny flicker of hope. But as the reality of her situation set in, fear took over. She was alone. Jackson didn't even know. And after what he had done, she had no intention of telling him. He had made his choice when he left her on their wedding day. As the weeks turned into months, Emily's fear was replaced by determination. She would do this on her own. She didn't need Jackson. And she certainly didn't need his money. She would find a way to provide for her child, no matter how hard it was. But the universe had one more surprise in store for her. At her first ultrasound appointment, the doctor gave her a look of awe as he announced, "You're having quadruplets. 4 babies." Emily could hardly believe it. The weight of it was overwhelming. How would she afford to care for 4 children on her own? How would she find the strength to raise them without any support? But as she sat in that small, sterile room, cradling her growing belly, a sense of calm washed over her. These 4 lives were a miracle. A gift she hadn't expected. They would be her everything. Her reason to keep going. And so, with every ounce of strength she had, Emily began her journey. She found work at a small marketing firm during the day and took on freelance graphic design projects at night. She pinched pennies, saving every dollar she could to prepare for her baby's arrival. It wasn't easy. There were nights she cried herself to sleep, exhausted and overwhelmed. But every kick, every flutter of movement from her belly reminded her that she was doing this for them. Emily Hayes, once a bride abandoned at the altar, was now a mother-to-be, determined to create a life of love and hope for her children. Little did she know, her journey was just beginning. The day the quadruplets were born was both the most terrifying and miraculous day of Emily's life. The hospital room buzzed with activity, nurses rushing in and out, the steady hum of monitors beeping in the background, and the low murmur of doctors' voices preparing for what they all called a high-risk delivery. Emily lay on the hospital bed, her body tense but her heart steady, focused entirely on what was about to happen. She gripped the edge of the bed, her breathing labored as the contractions came faster and more intense. "Emily, you're doing amazing," one of the nurses reassured her. Holding her hand tightly, Emily wanted to laugh. Amazing didn't begin to describe how she felt. She was equal parts exhilarated and terrified. 1,000 questions racing through her mind. Would they be healthy? Could she handle raising 4 babies at once? Would they forgive her someday for the life she knew she wouldn't be able to give them right away, a life without a father? After hours of labor that felt like an eternity, the room was filled with the sound of the first newborn cry. Emily's heart stopped as she looked up at the doctor. who held a small, wriggling baby in his hands. "It's a boy," he announced with a wide smile. Tears welled up in her eyes as the nurse placed the tiny baby against her chest. He was perfect. His face scrunched up in protest as he let out a piercing wail. But Emily didn't have much time to savor the moment. Within minutes, another cry filled the air, and then another, and another. By the end of it, Emily had 4 tiny miracles: Jack, James, Jake, and Jessie. Each one small but strong, their cries loud and insistent as they made their way into the world. Emily was exhausted, her body aching from the effort. But as she looked down at her 4 sons, a surge of love unlike anything she had ever felt flooded her entire being. "They're beautiful," she whispered, her voice trembling as she brushed a tear from her cheek. "They are," one of the nurses said warmly, gently patting Emily's shoulder. "And so are you, Emily. You're stronger than you realize." That strength would be tested in the days, weeks, and years to come. Life with 4 newborns was a whirlwind. Emily barely had time to sleep or eat, her entire world revolving around feeding schedules, diaper changes, and soothing cries at all hours of the day and night. Her tiny apartment quickly became crowded with cribs, bottles, and baby clothes. The space that once felt lonely now brimmed with life and noise. The first year was the hardest. Emily worked tirelessly to provide for her sons, juggling 2 jobs and surviving on little more than coffee and sheer willpower. She worked as a marketing assistant during the day, barely making enough to cover rent and groceries, and then spent her evenings as a freelance graphic designer, taking on as many clients as she could handle. It was a constant hustle. But she did it. Every time she felt like giving up, she would look into the boy's identical blue eyes, the same piercing blue as Jackson's, and find the strength to keep going. Despite the chaos and exhaustion, there were moments of joy that made it all worthwhile. The first time Jack smiled at her, the sound of James's uncontrollable giggles, Jake's fascination with the world around him, and Jess's tiny hand clutching hers during nap time. Those moments reminded her that the sacrifices she was making were for something greater than herself. They were her world, her reason for pushing through the hardest days. But no matter how much love and effort she poured into raising her sons, there was always an ache that lingered in the back of her heart, a fear that she wasn't enough. The boys were growing fast, their personalities shining through with each passing day. Jack was the leader, always the first to try something new. James was quiet and thoughtful, preferring to sit back and observe. Jake was the dreamer, constantly drawing pictures or building intricate towers out of blocks. And Jessie, the youngest by just a few minutes, was the troublemaker, always finding ways to keep Emily on her toes. Strangers often stopped Emily on the street, marveling at her boys. "They're adorable," people would say, and Emily would smile, her heart swelling with pride. But then there were the comments that cut deeper. "Wow, 4 boys. That must be overwhelming. Where's their dad?" Emily had become an expert at brushing off those questions with polite but vague answers. Jackson Reed was a name she never spoke aloud, not even in the privacy of her own mind. He was a ghost in her life, a man she had once loved but who had no place in the world she had built for herself and her children. That was until the day she saw him again. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that felt too perfect to be real. Emily had taken the boys to the park, a rare break from their usual routine. They laughed and played on the swings, their tiny voices ringing out in the crisp autumn air. Emily sat on a bench nearby, watching them with a soft smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of peace. But then she felt it, a prickle at the back of her neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. She turned her head, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes locked onto a figure standing just a few feet away. It was Jackson. He was different than she remembered. His features sharper, his suit tailored to perfection. But his piercing blue eyes, those were the same. For a moment, Emily couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world around her seemed to fade as she stared at the man who had once been her entire world. "Emily," he said softly, taking a step toward her. She shook her head, instinctively moving in front of the boys as if to shield them from him. Her heart pounded as a mix of anger, fear, and something she couldn't quite name rose in her chest. Jackson's eyes flicked to the boys, his expression shifting from confusion to realization. The color drained from his face as he looked at them, at their identical blue eyes, their sandy brown hair, and the way they laughed together. "Are they?" His voice trailed off, thick with emotion. Emily's hands clenched into fists. She could barely find the words, her voice trembling as she whispered, "They're not yours." But Jackson wasn't fooled. She could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at them with a mix of awe and disbelief. And in that moment, she knew her carefully constructed world was about to unravel. The moment those words left Emily's mouth, she regretted them. "They're not yours." The lie felt heavy in the air, hanging between them like a wall she desperately needed to erect, even if she knew it wouldn't hold. Jackson's piercing blue eyes were fixed on her, searching, calculating, and, most heartbreakingly, pleading. He didn't believe her. Not for a second. The boys, oblivious to the tension thickening the air, continued to play, their laughter ringing out in sharp contrast to the storm brewing between their parents. Emily's heartbeat pounded in her ears as Jackson took another step forward, closing the space between them. "Emily," he said softly, his voice cracking slightly, "please, don't do this. I can see it. They're mine." "Aren't they?" She felt the words clawing at her throat. The urge to scream at him, to tell him exactly how he had abandoned her when she needed him most. But instead, she took a step back, her arms crossing protectively over her chest. "It doesn't matter, Jackson," she said, her voice low but steady. "You made your choice. You left. We don't need you." He flinched as though she had struck him. For a moment, he looked like the Jackson she used to know, the young man who had promised her the world. The man who had held her hand as they talked about building a life together. But that man was long gone. The man before her now was someone else entirely, a stranger wrapped in wealth and success. A man who had no place in her world anymore. Jackson opened his mouth to reply. But before he could speak, Jack, the eldest of the boys, ran toward them, his cheeks flushed from playing. "Mommy," he called, holding up a leaf he had found on the ground. "Look, it's shaped like a star." Emily forced a smile, bending down to examine the leaf as though her heart wasn't breaking into a million pieces. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, brushing a hand over his sandy brown hair. Jack's bright blue eyes, so much like Jackson's, shifted to the man standing just a few feet away, his small face scrunched up in confusion. "Who's that?" "Mommy." The question hung in the air like a ticking bomb. Emily's breath hitched, and for a moment, she couldn't think of how to answer. But Jackson, to her surprise, crouched down to Jack's level, his expression softening. "Hi, buddy," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm an old friend of your mom's." Emily's chest tightened as she watched the interaction. She didn't want this. She didn't want him worming his way into their lives, confusing her boys, upending the fragile peace she had worked so hard to create. But as Jack looked at Jackson, his little head tilting curiously, she could see the wheels turning in his mind. Even at his young age, Jack could sense something was different, something unspoken. Jack shrugged, his attention already shifting back to his brothers. "Okay," he said simply before running back to the playground. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She stood up, her arms once again crossing over her chest as she glared at Jackson. "You can't just show up here, Jackson," she said, her voice low but fierce. "You don't get to decide you care now after everything." "I didn't know, Emily," he said, his voice rising slightly, frustration flickering across his face. "You never told me. And what would you have done if I had?" She shot back, her anger bubbling to the surface. You left me, Jackson. On our wedding day. Do you even understand what that did to me? What I went through? He took a step closer. His expression pained. I made a mistake, he said. His voice softer now. I thought I was doing the right thing. I wasn't ready. I didn't think I was good enough for you. Emily let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you wanted, didn't you? Your company, your success, your perfect little life. So why are you here now? Because I need to make it right, he said, his voice firm. Because they're my kids, Emily. And I can see that now. I can feel it. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. You don't get to make this about you, she said, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. You don't get to waltz back in and act like you care after disappearing for 4 years. Jackson's jaw tightened. And for a moment, he didn't respond. He simply looked at her. His eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place, regret. Maybe. Or guilt. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, he said finally. But I want to try. For them. Emily stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. A part of her wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that he was here for the right reasons. But the pain of the past was too fresh. The scars too deep. She couldn't just let him back in. Not without a fight. You'll have to prove it, she said quietly, her voice steady. I'm not letting you hurt them the way you hurt me. Jackson nodded, his expression resolute. I will, he said. I'll prove it to you. Emily didn't respond. She turned her back on him, calling out to the boys. Come on. Guys. Time to go home. The boys ran to her, their little hands reaching for hers as they chatted excitedly about their day. Jackson stood there, watching as she walked away with the children he now knew were his. He didn't call out to her, didn't try to stop her. But as Emily glanced back over her shoulder, she saw the look in his eyes, the determination, the resolve. She knew this wasn't over. Jackson wasn't going to give up. And deep down, a part of her feared what that meant for the life she had worked so hard to build. As the years passed, Emily's life slowly found its rhythm again. Her boys grew up surrounded by love, laughter, and the warmth of a mother who had fought every battle to protect them. Jackson remained in their lives, not as the man she once loved, but as a father learning how to be present. It wasn't always easy, trust was fragile, and healing took time, but together, they managed to create a fragile balance for the sake of the children. On a sunny afternoon, as the boys played in the yard, Emily watched them with a peaceful smile. She had learned that strength wasn't about forgetting the past but about moving forward despite it. Her family wasn't perfect, but it was hers. If you enjoyed today's story, please like, subscribe to Life Stories and activate the notification bell to never miss an emotional and inspiring journey like this. See you in the next story.